Good afternoon, or good morning, everyone. I'm Eric Lufer, the president of the Citizens Research Council of Michigan, and I'd like to welcome you to CRC's webinar on the 2017 executive budget. This webinar is being presented by the Citizens Research Council of Michigan. CRC is a statewide nonpartisan public affairs research group. This is CRC's 100th year of operation, a longevity we attribute to our promotion of sound public policy for state and local governments through accurate, independent, and objective research. We are a private, not-for-profit entity, and we rely on the charitable contributions of foundations, businesses, and corporations. I'd encourage all of you to join our circle of supporters and help us to continue to provide high-quality, independent information on important public policy topics in Michigan. If you value how this webinar and the other material from the Citizens Research Council contributes to the public discourse and hope to keep CRC as an objective, independent, credible source of information into our next century, please consider a contribution. Please note we are recording this webinar and we will post it on our webpage where it will be available for future viewing. Also, we have everyone but the presenters on mute, so we will not be able to hear you speak. The GoToWebinar software has this neat feature where you can raise your hand, but we decided that doesn't work well for us. We rely on the question function. You see a little box on the GoToWebinar software. You can enter your questions there and we will attempt to answer as many questions as we can at the end of our presentation. If you have any technical problems during the webinar, please let us know by calling 734-542-8001. After the webinar, you will receive an email soliciting your feedback, and we would very much appreciate any feedback you have. We have commissioned a book on the history of the Citizens Research Council as part of our centennial. That book is identifying a number of governmental reforms we can attribute to our public policy analysis in a number of issues that we've identified as needing reform that remain in need of reform even to this day. Among the items we place in our win column is the executive budget. This is something we take for granted today, but it has not always been as we know it. Michigan state government was at one time overwhelmed with departments, commissions, and bureaus all acting independently and identifying their budget needs and attempting to justify those needs to the legislature for funding. The Citizens Research Council helped policymakers to see the need for departments that answer to the governor and a spending plan that pulls all those needs together before being submitted to the legislature. The history of the Citizens Research Council also shows how we have played a significant role in helping the state identify budget deficits and alternatives for addressing those challenges. Consistent with that role, we continue to monitor the state budget, revenue flows, and spending patterns, and that effort continues today with a look at the fiscal year 2017 executive budget. To undertake that effort, we have two speakers today, Robert Snyder and Craig Thiel. Bob has been with the Research Council for 3 years now. He most recently served as Associate Director for the nonpartisan Michigan House Fiscal Agency. During his 16-year tenure at House Fiscal, he developed extensive expertise and provided nonpartisan advice and analysis to state House members on policy and budget matters in areas including corrections, human services, and transportation. Craig Thiel joined CRC in 2006 and currently serves as Senior Research Associate assigned to education matters. Before coming to CRC, Craig worked for the Senate Fiscal Agency for 6 years and for the House Fiscal Agency for 3 years. Previous to his time with the legislature, he held positions with the Department of State and the United States Environmental Protection Agency in Chicago. So with that, let me turn things over to Bob Snyder and we'll get started.
Thank you very much, Eric, and good morning to everyone. This is Bob Snyder. I'm Director of State Affairs here at CRC, and We plan to do a walkthrough today, as Eric indicated, of the governor's fiscal year 2017 budget proposal, which is about 9 days old now. Hopefully, we're going to leave you better informed today, not only of what's in the budget, but we're going to close with sort of a long-run look at our budget outlook, revenues and expenditures going forward in fiscal year 2018, 19, and 20, and kind of a long-run view. Let's start with just a quick outline then of the different issues we're going to be covering today. We're going to start with a review of the state revenue picture. We're going to see there's continued growth in expected in state revenues. But there are also some tax policy changes that are going to constrain that future growth, and we'll review some of those factors. Then we're going to move into the situation facing the governor coming into the current fiscal year due to some January revenue forecast revisions. The governor had a significant surplus at his hands coming into fiscal year 2016, and we're going to move into the governor's budget recommendation and see that the governor's proposed some significant one-time funding, including funding for the city of Flint water crisis, including some funds for Detroit public schools, some infrastructure funds as well in fiscal year 2016 that will lead into that surplus. And then for the fiscal year 2017 budget, despite there being fairly slight growth, there are some significant spending enhancements proposed that are made possible by the freeing up of some general fund that until fiscal year 2017 had been committed to road repairs. And then we're going to close with an assessment of the proposal, again looking forward and looking at budget pressures and revenues and kind of taking a long-run, long-term outlook of the budget picture. So we're going to start by reviewing state revenues, and we're going to focus on the state's two major revenue funds, our general fund, general purpose revenues, which equate to about $10 billion a year and constitute probably 90% of the annual state budget deliberations each year, how we allocate that discretionary revenue to the state, and also our state school aid fund, about just over $12 billion annual revenue fund, and of course the majority of that is devoted to K-12 education purposes. So as some of you may know, state economists gather twice each year to review revenue estimates, and those estimates are used as a core of state budget development and put basically the limits on the revenue expectations on which the state budget is based. This chart takes a look at those estimates from last May, the blue line for general fund, general purpose revenues, and then the most recently revised estimates from January 2016, the orange line for general fund. And this January we had a pleasant surprise. We found about a $309 million upward revision in general fund revenue expectations from the prior May estimates. That had to do with a couple factors. First, higher income tax collections. We saw some significant income tax growth, particularly with quarterly and annual payments, and there's thoughts that that's probably one-time in nature, has to do with capital gains taking on the part of investors that provided a one-time buffer to our income tax revenues. And the second piece of that was some delayed business tax credit claims under our new business tax structure. Certain companies in Michigan are still eligible to file under the Michigan business tax in order to claim certificated credits, and there were some credits that were anticipated in May to be claimed that were not, and that left more revenue on the table and contributed to that boost in the forecast. As you see in fiscal year 2016, revenues actually are expected to fall, and that's because the inverse is expected to happen. We're not going to get that one-time income tax boom from capital gains, and the credits that weren't claimed in 2015 likely will be claimed in 2016. A factor that didn't get as much attention, if you look outward to fiscal year 2019, is a significant downgrade in general fund revenues looking forward. And we try to look at some of the factors behind that in this slide. Within the last years, and even since the May forecast, we've had some significant tax policy changes that are going to redirect some of that state general fund general purpose revenue, which we highlight here on this slide. The first existing redirection comes from the personal property tax repeal legislation that was enacted and approved by voters about a year and a half ago. The state use tax, which goes to the general, the piece that goes to the general fund, will begin to be redirected in fiscal year 2016. It'll be to $72 million and grow to over $400 million by fiscal year 2020, and that use tax redirection will be used to reimburse local units of government for their lost personal property tax revenues. So that's a significant redirection of state revenue that otherwise would go to the general fund, and we see that portion in orange on this chart. Two other redirections were part of the road plan passed late last year. First, in the gray area, we outlined the income tax revenue that will be redirected to roads. Again, generally this would go to the state general fund, but starting in 2019, $150 million, and eventually growing in fiscal year 2021 to $600 million will be reallocated for road purposes. And then finally, also part of the road plan in the yellow area, the road plan in an effort to sort of mitigate the impact of the tax increases on lower income households, also included an enhanced homestead property tax credit, and it's anticipated that that should cost the state about $200 million in income tax revenue on an annual basis, and that's shown in the yellow area. So there'll still be growth. As you can see, the blue area is our expected general fund going into the future, and if you go from 2014 to 2020, that equates to realized growth of about 2.9% per year. That's still a healthy growth rate, but we do lose about $1 billion in potential revenue, and had we retained that revenue in the general fund, that growth rate over the same time period would have been closer to 4.4%. So some significant redirection of general fund, and that of course means that in the out years there will be some trade-offs in terms of revenue available for spending and budgeting as well. Let's take a quick longer-term view at the general fund. This tracks both actual general fund revenue in the orange line on top and inflation-adjusted revenues for the general fund on the blue line from fiscal year 2000. And you'll see a couple trends leap out at you. Since fiscal year 2010, at the end of the Great Recession, we've had some steady growth in the general fund. If we look at actual revenue, annual growth has exceeded 4%. That's significantly above the inflation rate, and for that same reason, then you see the real revenues have grown since that time as well. But then the bigger picture, the long-run trend, given the difficulties that Michigan experienced economically during even the first part of the 2000 to 2010 decade, and then of course climaxing with the Great Recession, if forecasts hold from January, general fund in 2018 will still be slightly below the actual dollar general fund that we had available in fiscal year 2000, and in inflation-adjusted terms will still be down about 28% from where we were in fiscal year 2000. So now let's look at the forecast revisions for the school aid fund. In general here, there was a more consistent downward adjustment in revenues. Ironically, a lot of that was due to low gas prices and their impact on the sales tax. The school aid fund is highly sales tax dependent, and when gasoline prices fall, we collect less at the pump then in the 6% from the 6% sales tax. And even though consumers see their budget constraints, then we can spend money in other areas. Often those areas aren't, if they're spent on services or items that are aren't subject to the sales tax, we get a decline in those revenues. So again, 136 million in 2015, and pretty consistently about over 100 million in the out years as well through fiscal year 2018. That same historical look at the school aid fund shows that school aid fund growth was not as constrained during that first decade of the new millennium as the general fund. It was certainly not healthy growth, but it didn't see the dips that we saw in the on the general fund slide. That again has a little bit to do with the emphasis on sales and use tax for the school aid fund, which is not quite as impacted by the business cycle. There were also a lot of tax policy decisions, whether it was when tax rates were reduced or certain exemptions or credits were introduced to hold the school aid fund harmless from some of those impacts, and the general fund took the brunt of those. As you'll see, the school aid fund did take a hit in 2012 with the repeal of the Michigan business tax, but since then, since 2012, we've had about 2.8% regular, pretty consistent growth, and that's been consistent since that time. Slower than the general fund, though. So in terms of growth rates, general fund is growing faster than the school aid fund at the moment. We wanted to talk about, before we go to the budget, a few tax policy and tax considerations that will have an impact on the budget this year, and just quickly go over those. There are three key items that are relevant here. First, the state is going to lose its ability to assess its current 6% use tax on Medicaid health maintenance organizations. The federal government, this has been used as a Medicaid financing tool. We assess the 6% use tax on the HMOs. We then basically pay the HMOs back through their reimbursement rates, but in doing that we draw federal revenue as well, and the state sees some net savings that can help deal with general fund issues. From a revenue standpoint, it's $400 million to the general fund, $200 million to the school aid fund from that source. The feds have indicated that Michigan and as well as other states that have similar mechanisms must repeal them by January 2017. So that'll be 3/4 of that impact will hit the 2017 budget. Related to that, Michigan also has a health insurance claims assessment, the HICA assessment, that's currently at 0.75% tax paid on health claims in Michigan. Because of the HMO use tax disallowment, that there's current language and current law that triggers an increase in that rate to 1%. That will boost revenue by $80 million and help offset general fund. But an important factor is that this HICA assessment sunsets in January 2018. The governor in his budget request has requested an extension. That's been a dicey issue with the legislature, so we'll see where that goes. And finally, it's worth mentioning there's a new insurance premium tax credit to auto insurers that was sort of a surprise, unveiled in the January consensus. It got some discussion. It appears this was an unintended consequence of some changes in law in 2012 regarding assigned claims. So when a uninsured motorist gets into an accident and there are medical claims for a passenger perhaps, or a pedestrian is hit, those have traditionally gone through the Department of State. There's an assigned claims plan that farms those claims out to participating insurers. The insurers pay into that fund. And what happened in 2012 is the traditional administration of that was shifted from the Department of State to the Michigan Automobile Insurance Placement Facility, which is an existing nonprofit association of insurers. They handle there's an existing program that handles the provision of auto insurance to high-risk drivers. They also now will handle assigned claims, the administration of assigned claims. But what was found is that shift in administration also triggered an increase in tax credits for auto insurers. As insurers pay into assigned claims with the new Michigan Automobile Insurance Placement Facility, those payments, unlike the payments in the old fund under the Department of State, are to receive a tax credit under the current premium tax that's part of the corporate income tax. So suddenly the state was losing an estimated $80 million a year in revenue. $60 million in fiscal year 2016, but $80 million thereafter, and the governor has proposed closing this credit in his budget. That would basically mean that the state would recover another $80 million in general fund beyond those consensus estimates. So with that discussion of the revenue picture, we're going to look at the state budget situation coming into our current fiscal year. And again, we talked about that surprise revenue from the general fund, and at least in the short run, how has that affected our revenue picture coming into the current fiscal year? We had a very significant boost in revenue balances for the general fund. Because of those upward revenue adjustments that we talked about, the general fund closing balance at the end of fiscal year 2015 was expected to be $695 million. The school aid fund, we saw there were downward revisions, but it would still close fiscal year 2015 with a $190 million balance. So as an end result, close to $900 million between the two funds will be available as we enter this current fiscal year. So the governor had a decision to make now with his 2017 budget coming out, what to do with that one-time surplus revenue. And the governor last Wednesday answered that question by releasing, along with his fiscal year 2017 proposal, a very significant supplemental budget request for the current year, and those addressed various one-time needs, which are reviewed here. Primarily $157 million total, $131 million in general fund to address the Flint water crisis. We're going to take a look on the next slide at some details of that. A proposal for $165 million, all general fund, to a new Michigan infrastructure fund, which would be established in statute. The governor's budget message emphasized using this to replace high-risk lead and copper service lines into homes. That would not be limited to Flint, but across the state as well. In his State of the State message, he also talked about other infrastructure needs, not only water and sewer, but electrical grid issues, broadband issues. He mentioned infrastructure needs at the Sioux Locks. There will be a commission on 21st century infrastructure that would, under his proposal, guide the prioritization of this fund. Also $50 million for the Detroit Public Schools, all general fund. We're going to discuss that money and other Detroit public school reforms and budget implications when Craig discusses the education issues later in the budget. Altogether, $381 million in general fund in that supplemental request. The Flint issues are just outlined briefly here. Early childhood education and intervention programs this slide shows both the 2016 supplemental request in the first column. It also includes items that are retained in the fiscal year 2017 budget. So we look at both kind of the big picture of the Flint water money in this one slide. For early education and intervention programs, about $45 million in total across the 2 years, $25 million in general fund. Another $17 million across the 2 years for public health and further nutritional and restaurant inspection services in Flint. The biggest part of the supplemental request had to do with the Flint water system and residential bills, $63 million in the supplemental. $30 million of that would go to residential water bill relief. The House yesterday just approved that portion of the supplemental request. Replacement of high-risk lead service lines, $25 million, and other water testing and response needs. This would also include money to help Flint stay connected to the Detroit water system and meet some of those cost needs in the city. And then finally, some reserve funds were set aside, $50 million in general fund, $14 million in different federal social welfare funds for future needs as it's determined what the high priorities are. There would be some funds available in reserve to meet the needs as they're more fully identified. So with the supplemental, the surplus that we talked about, which is in the beginning balance at the top, almost $885 million, in both the general fund and the school aid fund, is drawn down. We have the executive supplemental for $381 million that takes a good chunk of that general fund surplus, and then further both we're spending more than we're taking in both funds. So by the end of fiscal year 2016 and coming into fiscal year 2017 then in the governor's budget proposal, that large surplus is drawn down fairly significantly, about $152 million in general fund and a little under $50 million in the school aid fund will be brought into fiscal year 2017 if this supplemental spending plan is approved. So now on to the governor's budget proposal for fiscal year 2017, and we'll see just a kind of a high-level overview of what's being proposed. In all, the governor has proposed a $54 billion budget from all sources. That's pretty slight growth, 0.7% growth from the current year-to-date appropriations. Overall, in the general fund, growth is slightly higher at 1.3%, just over $10 billion, but again, a fairly modest growth rate in general fund. What we're going to see as we go through some of the budget details is despite the slight growth rate in the general fund, there are some things going on, and in terms of redirecting some current general fund, particularly revenue that has been dedicated to roads and will no longer be dedicated to roads. That redirection has allowed for some new spending enhancements in some key priority areas. So with that, I'm going to turn the mic over to my colleague Craig Thiel, and he is going to run through some of the education highlights within the governor's budget recommendation. I'll give us just a moment, and I'm going to let Craig take the headphones here.
All right. I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or so kind of hitting the highlights of the education-related budgets, specifically the school aid budget and the higher ed budget. So let me just start by sharing with you the total spending for school aid at $14.2 billion. This is a modest increase of about 2%. When we look at the budget and just look at the state spending, basically the support that the school aid fund and the general fund are providing to K-12 education specifically, so ignoring the support of early childhood programs, adult education, it's about $12.1 billion. So obviously the lion's share of the school aid budget is going to K-12. It's up $1.4 billion since 2011, so that's the good news. The bad news, I think, is a lot of this money isn't finding its way necessarily into the classroom directly. It's being used to support increased retirement costs, specifically funding for some legacy costs for unfunded liabilities. So I'm going to hit just 4 areas in the school aid budget. There's a lot more in the budget, and we welcome any questions you might have about other issues, but these are the 4 issues that I think are most important as we look at the 2017 proposal. There's a moderate increase in the per-pupil foundation grant that all districts receive for their operating support. There is significant funding put forward to match the governor's plan to deal with the legacy debts of Detroit Public Schools, and those dollars are in the school aid budget. The budget addresses an issue that is pervasive across the state in terms of declining enrollment and how that has affected individual school districts' finances, and there is attention given to that in the budget. And then finally, the issue of funding for state-required retirement contributions is addressed again in this budget. So looking at the foundation grant, governor's proposal would employ this 2x funding increase, which basically says the per pupil increase to the lowest spending districts would be 2 times as large as that given to the highest spending districts. So the proposal would move the minimum grant from $7,391 up to $7,511. That's a $120 per pupil increase. The hold harmless grant, which is basically the maximum grant that the state participates in, would increase $60 from $8,169 to $8,229. The districts that are in between the minimum grant and the hold harmless would get a something smaller than a 2x increase, but or something smaller than a 2x increase, but something larger than that $60 per pupil increase. So what this does in the long-term picture is it narrows this gap between the hold harmless grant at the top and the minimum grant. We looked back at 2000, and that gap was about $1,500. Under this proposal, it would be cut in half to about $718 per pupil. In terms of the number of districts that would be receiving the minimum grant, 66% of the districts would be at this minimum level compared to 40% just 7 years ago in 2010. So clearly addressing the issue of equity in this proposal. In terms of the Detroit Public Schools plan, what the governor is attempting to do is to deal with some legacy debts that the district has accumulated over the years. These are estimated to be about in the range of $500 million at the end of the current year we're in. These are debts that are fairly unique to DPS. It's been required to finance this debt really out of its operating revenues, the per pupil grant that it receives, a portion of that grant, to the tune of about $1,100 per pupil each year. And obviously this comes at the expense of current operations, as there's a requirement to pay the principal and interest on these legacy debts. The governor is proposing to split the Detroit Public Schools system into 2 entities, basically an old entity which would be tasked with paying off these legacy debts, and a new entity that would be responsible for educating kids. So we've seen this model used in some other smaller districts throughout the state that have been dealing with challenges on the financial front, most notably Muskegon Heights School District and Highland Park School District, where the district was split into 2 entities. One really just tasked with funding debts and paying off vendors, and the new district is responsible for doing the education. The way the financing of the legacy debts occurs in those other districts, as well as what's being proposed for DPS, would be to repurpose the local school operating tax. This is the 18 mil tax. It's levied primarily on non-homestead business property in the district. That money is currently used to help finance the per pupil grant in the district. Under the proposal, the money would be reallocated for debt repayment. To ensure that the kids and the funding for the DPS students isn't affected negatively by this, the governor proposes to backfill that $72 million with some money from the tobacco settlement revenue, basically a dollar for dollar reimbursement to the school aid fund for pulling out those local dollars. There's other components that have been talked about in the reform package, primarily centered around governance structures, as well as education reforms. Those haven't been introduced in the legislature and are not reflected in this proposal. Right now, what we have in the budget is really just the financial piece, and that's what I've covered here. As Bob mentioned earlier in the supplemental, there's $50 million general fund provided for the current year to help the district manage a cash flow situation that it's facing. Basically, the district is at a position where at its current spending projection, it won't be able to finish the year in the black, and so an immediate infusion of cash is being recommended for the district, this $50 million. An issue that has been a statewide challenge for school districts really since the mid-2000s is the declining enrollment. Basically, the number of public school students across the state has been shrinking since the mid-2000s. At the same time that dynamic is taking place, we're seeing more education providers across the state in the form of charter schools. This has resulted in just fewer kids spread across more school districts, and the mathematical result is just declining enrollment. 72% of the traditional public school districts lost enrollment between 2014 and 2015. So you can see this is not an isolated issue. It's pretty pervasive. It's in urban districts, suburban, and rural as well. So it kind of cuts across all district types. And this is a challenge because the vast majority of operating resources comes through the foundation grant, and the funding really comes down immediately with the change in enrollment. And for school districts, the spending is somewhat sticky in the short run. It takes some time to adjust to these revenue changes. If a district loses 3% of its enrollment, and that might equate to 30 to 50 kids, those 30 to 50 kids are not concentrated in one grade or even one school. They're spread across multiple grades, multiple schools, and it's not simply the case that a single teacher in one grade position can be eliminated or reassigned to it to adjust to that reality. So spending, at least in the short run, is a little sticky, and it takes some time for for school districts to adjust to this declining enrollment. So acknowledging that this has been a problem and an ongoing problem, the governor's budget makes a significant change in how we count students. Basically, student count takes place twice a year, once in the fall, and then a supplemental count in February of the current year, and then those two counts are used to come up with a student membership. Currently, we're using 90% from the fall count, and then 10% from the previous year's supplemental count as the weighting factor for student membership. The governor's proposal switches it to a 50-50, so giving equal weight to basically the current year and the previous year enrollment. This is significant in that the last time we've had a 50-50 split was in 1997. Since that time, there's been greater weight put on the current year count, and as recent as the 2015 school year, there was no weight actually given to the previous year count. So again, this will help districts, declining enrollment districts, kind of adjust to those enrollment losses. It gives them a little additional time to adjust their budgets. It doesn't by any means put off or not make them adjust their budget. They will ultimately have to phase in those enrollment declines, but it just gives them a little extra time to do that. This has been an issue, funding retirement contributions for school districts for a number of years, and it's taken on much more significance in the last half dozen years, largely because of the growth in unfunded liabilities, both for the pension plan as well as the retiree health plan. In total, you're looking at almost $40 billion in unfunded liabilities across these two plans, and the requirement to fund these liabilities over the next 20 plus years falls to the school aid fund. Because of some reforms that were put in place in 2012, the state has directly taken on the funding responsibility for a portion of this liability, and then districts are responsible for another piece. The state's share is basically is variable, whereas the district share is fixed in law, and as the liabilities have increased, we've seen the state share of the financing responsibility increase. And in this year, there's an increase of $89 million to accommodate the funding of these liabilities. This will bring the total amount that the state is paying for the unfunded liabilities to just under $1 billion. This growth has happened over the last 4 years since the reforms have been put in place. This represents about 11.7% of the covered payroll, or about $729 per pupil that the state's picking up of the financing responsibility. As we look forward in 2018, there would be another increase in the state share, but a much smaller increase, only about $6 million, and then we expect that state contribution, roughly in the $1 billion neighborhood, would level off, and it would be consistent for a number of years. Again, the district share remains fixed at 20.96% of payroll. So the good news is that the state's picking this up. This isn't on the districts. The bad news is it's picking it up out of the school aid fund, so obviously these are resources that otherwise go to school districts across the state. The governor's maintaining a $100 million program to help districts with their general retirement costs, and this equates to about $70 million, so really no change there, but it is some assistance provided for these retirement costs that districts have. And I wanted to just share with you briefly a look at the effects of these escalating retirement contributions on the per-pupil funding. As you can see from this slide, it amounts to about, the combined contributions amount to about $2,000 per pupil this year. Districts are responsible for about $1,300 of their foundation grant is going to fund the retirement contributions. And then about $700, as I mentioned, is being picked up by the state. Over time, what this has done is it has reduced the amount of discretionary resources that districts have at their disposal because of the escalating retirement contributions. Looking back as far as just as recently as 2011, districts had about $6,200 of their grant to operate school district. Over the years, that amount has declined. It's gradually ratcheting up here, but still in 2017, the district's about $6,176 of discretionary resources to use towards operating expenses. Now quickly, I want to just highlight the higher education recommendation. The governor is proposing a fairly significant increase, 4.4%, largely to restore the cuts that were made in 2012 when the higher ed budget was reduced 15%. basically across the board reduction to operation funding for the 15 public universities. This is about a $60 million increase for the 15 publics. It would all be provided through the performance funding formula that has been in place since 2012. Because of the way the formula works out, individual funding increases range from about 3.5% to 6.8%. It should be noted that the governor does restore the full 15% cut that was done in 2012 in the aggregate, but a number of districts, a number of universities are still shy of where they were in 2011 before the cuts. And the reason there is because the funding increases that have been provided over time have been not across the board, but instead have been provided via this performance funding formula. So a number of districts, a number of universities are still below their 2011 level, but in the aggregate, higher ed cuts have been restored. The governor conditions appropriations on a tuition restraint language. This has been a common provision in the budget for the last half a dozen years. He's recommending a cap of 4.8%, well in excess of any inflationary rate that we might see. He's also recommending additional dollars for the 7 universities that participate in the statewide retirement system, help them meet their retirement funding obligations, specifically having to do with their unfunded liability. The governor's recommending $6 million to cover any of the liabilities above the 25.7% of payroll. This is similar to the cap that is in place for the K-12 districts. The governor's recommending a change in statutory law to implement a similar cap, and the funding is provided in the higher ed budget. And then just a point that the school aid fund is continuing to support the higher education appropriations to the tune of about $237 million. And this just provides, this graph here provides a look at the restoration of those cuts. You can see with the proposed increase, total aggregate funding is back at the $1.42 billion mark that was in place in 2011. But in terms of inflation-adjusted dollars, still about $100 million below the 2011 funding. So in nominal terms, the cuts have been restored, but in terms of purchasing power, still short. In that regard. And with that, I'm going to shift back over to Bob and let him cover some other areas of the budget.
Thank you, Craig. So with the education components covered, we're going to turn back to some general budget issues facing the state. And we're going to start with some prominent changes and cost pressures within the state Medicaid program. We're going to look at 3 factors here that have resulted in some increased Medicaid costs that are having to be factored into the 2017 budget recommendation. The first is the Healthy Michigan Plan, our state's Medicaid expansion, beginning in January 2017. Up until this point, the healthcare-related costs of the Medicaid expansion have been met by the federal government. But for states that did elect to expand Medicaid starting in January 2017, states will be subject to 5% matching requirements towards those expansion costs. That's going to affect 3/4 of fiscal year 2017, and there's a appropriation of just over $106 million in general fund costs to meet that match requirement. Those match rates will continue to expand for the state. So beginning in January 2018, the 5% goes to 6%. In January 2019, it's 7%, and then in January 2020, that match rate phases up to 10%. So those match costs will continue to escalate in the next several years. Another big cost driver in this year's budget is specialty drugs. There have been some new specialty drugs added to the approved Medicaid formulary for treatment of hepatitis C, as well as cystic fibrosis, and they have been expensive. And the budget in the Health and Human Services area is increased by almost $100 million general fund to, one, cover the direct new cost of those drugs, and then $30 million of that $100 million is actually of the general fund is going to be used to create a new reserve fund for future drug cost needs, as there's some expectation that there will be some new cost pressures in this area as well. And then in general, just the traditional Medicaid caseload outside of the expanded component of Medicaid also saw some significant cost increases. In total, over $200 million in general fund will go towards the increases in the traditional caseload, including some increased state match costs for traditional Medicaid. One of the downsides, one of the few downsides, I suppose, but one of the downsides of an expanding state economy, per capita incomes are improving. The Medicaid match rate, the federal Medicaid assistance percentage, FMAP match rate, is determined by income comparisons across states, and because our income has improved, our state match under Medicaid has gone up slightly. Almost $50 million of the total caseload change is attributable just to that match rate change. There have also been some changes in financing mechanisms that have had some significant general fund impacts. First, in last year's budget, there was an agreement to increase the state's retainer under the our hospital provider tax, under what's called the QAP, or the Quality Assurance Assessment Program. That assesses a tax on hospitals. The revenue from the hospitals is used to match federal funds. That allows for increased reimbursement rates to hospitals, but at the same time, a portion of that, a retainer, is held back by the state to help offset other general fund costs in Medicaid. A one-time increase of $93 million was part of last year's budget. That was expected to then result in the need to backfill with general fund in this year's budget. Instead, the governor's actually proposed to expand that retainer. So instead of a $93 million increase in the state holdback from that provider tax, that will actually rise to $105 million, which will ease the need to put in additional general fund in that area. An important part of the overall budget, and that might make this work, and we'll see how the legislature deliberates on this, is there are no reductions to graduate medical education or other special hospital payments, and that may make this more acceptable to the hospitals, but we'll see where that proposal goes. The other key piece, we talked about the revenue side of this. With the disallowance of our use tax on Medicaid managed care organizations, we lose revenue, but on the spending side, it actually leads to some savings because we don't collect the use tax. We also don't then have to reimburse health plans for the cost of that use tax, which is partly paid out of general fund and negates some of the revenue increases. So that reimbursement will save, the reduction in reimbursement will save $140 million in general fund. And then, of course, we talked about the use tax triggering a HICA rate increase, at health insurance claims assessment. That new revenue will lead to $58 million in general fund savings. So all in all there, about we talked about a $400 million revenue hit down the road. We have about $200 million in general fund savings that are tied to those changes as well. We like to take a look each year at local revenue sharing changes. There's not a lot going on this year in terms of state shared revenue with local units of government. Cities, villages, and townships get a constitutionally dedicated payment from the sales tax. We dedicate 15% of the old 4% sales tax base pre-Proposal A to cities, villages, and townships. Those payments will go up 3.9%, cost just under $30 million from that sales tax allocation. One of the key changes that is not large in terms of dollar figures, but is impacting a subset of local units is a elimination of a discretionary allocation that was initiated in fiscal year 2014 to about 100 local units, mostly townships. Way back in fiscal year 2011, there were some changes made that saved the state some money. Basically, municipalities and townships that didn't receive at least $4,500 in discretionary statutory revenue sharing lost their payment. That was eliminated, so de minimis payments were eliminated. Those units, which is a large number of units, now only get constitutional revenue sharing. That changed in the fiscal year 2015 and was continued in the fiscal year 2016 budget. A special population-based payment was established. So for cities, villages, and townships with populations of at least 7,500, they would requalify for a discretionary payment based on their population. And about 100, those same 100 units, we'll see that go away under the governor's budget proposal. Again, we'll see what the legislature chimes in on this. So for those affected units, instead of seeing a healthier 3.5% to 4% increase based on constitutional growth, they'll see only constitutional growth, lose their existing discretionary payment, and overall they'll see about a 0.4% growth in their overall revenue sharing. So an isolated number of units are affected, mostly townships, but it will significantly curtail their growth in revenue sharing this year. No real changes in counties. They will continue to get their last year's allocation. 80% of that will come through general revenue sharing, and 20% remains through an incentive-based program similar to the cities, villages, and townships discretionary payment that relies on meeting certain transparency and accountability requirements. And then just quickly, the governor has proposed restoring for fiscal year 2017 a competitive grant assistance program at $11 million. That's a competitive grant program, and it's available to local units, which include the counties, municipalities, but also school districts, ISDs, who may be collaborating with local units on consolidation efforts or collaborative efforts that promise some cost savings. This would help fund the startup of those types of initiatives. And before we move into broader issues, what about the roads? The road funding has been a prominent budget issue for the last several fiscal years as the legislature has pursued, and until late last year, we're unable to arrive at a road funding plan. In last year's budget, $400 million in general fund, a discretionary general fund is included in the transportation budget to kind of top off our dedicated road funds as we continue to pursue a plan to increase those permanent dedicated funds. In this proposal, given that the road plan was passed late last year, all but $10.4 million of that general fund is removed from the fiscal year 2017 MDOT budget spending plan. That GF is replaced with the first year revenue from the transportation funding package. So as you recall, as of January 1st, 2017, We're going to see both motor fuel tax rates jump to 26.3 cents per gallon, and we're going to see about a 20% bump in our annual vehicle registration payments to the Department of State. That's expected to generate in 2017 about $412 million in new revenue. That revenue will replace the old general fund in the budget. It's worth noting, though, that's the road allocation. About $90 million, $100 million of the total new revenue, $90 million which would go to roads, is earmarked in the road plan to a roads innovation fund. And distribution of that, the roads innovation fund, the idea behind it was to pursue longer term, how can we change the manner in which we address our road repairs to create longer lasting roads and have a longer term impact and more bang for the buck of what we do to repair our roads. But so that 100 million, 90 million, which would go through the formula to roads, requires an okay from the legislature for distribution. The governor's budget assumes that okay will come from the legislature. Again, it will remain to be seen whether the legislature is satisfied with some of the planning that would allow that to happen. And this just quickly looks at then the long-term picture of future road revenues. Again, for 2014, 2015, 2016, in that light blue regions, we see general fund had been used as the legislature pursued a road plan to top off our existing revenues. The orange sections of this chart show the new road plan tax revenues from the motor fuel tax and the vehicle registration fees that will begin to accrue in 2017 and increase slightly in fiscal 2018. And then you see finally the redirection of income tax revenue from the general fund will take hold in 2019 and expand into 2021. A key takeaway from this graph, the expectation and the goal of the road funding plan all along has been to generate about $1.2 billion in new annual revenue. That has been a rough estimate of what's needed to try to turn the tide on our road infrastructure and get us back working towards a more acceptable steady state where we can have maybe 90% of our roads in good condition, particularly the expressways. That $1.2 billion is not going to actually see its way into the budget for several fiscal years as the road plan evolves and we wait for that redirection of income tax revenue. State employee compensation, just an annual cost driver in the budget. State employees are scheduled to get a 1% base pay increase and also an additional 1.5% of annual pay lump sum payment in October 2016. That, along with insurance costs, particularly health insurance, retirement contributions, and that includes OPEB and retiree health care costs into the pension system, will come to about $134 million overall and about $65 million in general fund. So we'll have that significant cost increase as well. Savings for future needs. Again, the governor did indeed propose some one-time investments. For instance, we talked about the creation of the infrastructure fund, putting a little money aside for specialty drugs for the future, but the governor did not propose any new deposits into the state's rainy day fund, our budget stabilization fund, for either fiscal year 2017 or 2018. We expect to have a balance at the close of the current fiscal year of about $611 million. That equates to about 2.8% of our combined general fund, school aid fund revenues. It's worth noting statute currently requires a pay-in to the BSF from tobacco settlement funds as reimbursement for a lump sum that was taken out of the BSF for the Detroit bankruptcy settlement. So if those pay-ins continue as statute dictates, we should stay around 2.8%. There'll be a little bit of influx, and that plus a little bit of interest earnings should keep us at around 2.8% into the future. So in closing, let's take a look at the big picture of the proposal and then look forward to what it might mean in the out years. First, a quick view of the governor's budget proposal from way up at 50,000 feet. We see despite the fact that there's fairly small growth in the general fund budget from 9.9 to just over $10 billion, in general, there is a lot going on within the budget, and in particular, I think that the key takeaway from this slide, you see that significant reduction in general fund for roads, almost $390 million, as well as some of those savings from the use tax. Those savings, and particularly the road savings, allowed for some of these other increases in the budget, whether it's the Medicaid match, the drug costs, a significant increase in general fund to the school aid budget, the employee compensation, the universities. Those lean pretty heavily on that general fund from the roads being redirected for those purposes. The future as we go forward, what happens in 2018 and beyond, as we talked about, those state Medicaid match costs will continue to rise through fiscal year 2020. The Medicaid managed care use tax that we talked about, we've eliminated most of that in this 2017 budget, but we're still getting about 25% of the revenue between October and the repeal date in January 2017, so there'll be a little bit of an adjustment in revenues and expenditures going forward in 2018 for that. We're going to continue to face inflationary type costs, personnel, Medicaid and public assistance caseloads, which vary greatly from year to year. Those will continue to be a cost pressure. And then it's worth noting, as we said, we aren't going to get the full $1.2 billion that was sort of the goal of the transportation road plan for several years, so there is a question as to whether we get some bad winters, whether pressure will mount to restore any general fund for the roads while we wait for the long-term road revenue to come to fruition. And finally, in closing, we do some modeling and look ahead. We make some assumptions here and look at the long-run budget stability through fiscal year 2020 for revenues and expenditures. So as background here, this chart, when we look at the revenue side, those adjusted revenue estimates basically are the current consensus revenue estimates. They are adjusted for that use tax elimination that we assume will continue to come over the next couple of years. It also assumes that the governor will get his wish to close that insurance credit. That adds $80 million per year in new revenue. On the spending side, we take fiscal year 2017 as our baseline. The governor's proposed almost $9.7 billion in ongoing appropriations. $340 million of the general fund appropriations are designated as one-time by the governor. On the governor's budget balance sheets, those zero out in the future, but the reality is each year we have, even if this year's one-time spending needs to go away, we have new ones the next year. So for our purposes, we do assume a carry forward of $100 million, which we see as a conservative estimate of sort of ongoing one-time needs, because there are new one-time needs each year, and to zero it out doesn't seem realistic. And then again, in that final Medicaid match use tax HICA column, we build in the known spending pressures that are coming from the Medicaid match in the out years. Then we look at the red numbers are basically the ongoing appropriations in the governor's budget, allowing for 2% annual growth built in 18, 19, and 2020. Can we do that with our revenues? Can we get through with 2% growth? And that ongoing growth, it's about $200 million per year, plus or minus a little bit. That would need to cover any state personnel cost increases. It would need to cover caseload increases, and to the extent that money is left over, then of course you can continue to do enhancements, whether it's to the K-12 money, higher education money, social welfare programs, or other state budget priorities. Does it work? Yes, it does. You'll see we maintain through this time period under these assumptions, we maintain a sufficient balance to cover these revenues. But if you look in the out year, and particularly 2020, by 2020, we are spending more than we're taking in. And remember, we have those long-run revenue pressures coming down the road. So the budget will be tight. And beyond fiscal year 2020 will be even more challenging given the current revenue and spending patterns. But you can get through this next 3-year period and support roughly 2% growth in those ongoing appropriations. So we hope this has been informative. We hope this, it's been educational for you. We appreciate everyone tuning in today. I'm going to turn the mic back over to Eric, and we will begin to take questions from you. Thank you once again for attending this morning.
Thanks, Bob, and thank you, Craig, for your contribution. As Bob said, that ends our prepared remarks, but we have some time set aside for some questions if you want to enter them in the dialog box on the GoToWebinar software. We have a few in. I also want to mention that we have been recording this, and it's going to be posted to our website as soon as the software can process it, and we'll get it online. So Bob, the first question, you very early in the presentation recapped the money that's already been set aside for Flint, either with a supplemental or in the governor's proposal. Should we expect that that's the end of the appropriation, or how does that fit with your concluding slide there that shows we have a tight budget going forward?
Yeah, that's a good question. The governor's budget proposal basically right now, and it says this is the money for Flint and the big investment in 2016, a smaller carry forward in 2017, but all of that is considered one-time in nature in 17, as I recall. I don't believe any of that would continue on. So basically, from the governor's perspective, this is the money for Flint. Whether, will there be additional needs and requests? I think it's likely that would be the case. And of course, the governor has put some money aside for the infrastructure fund, and a part of that could certainly help address Flint needs as well. But anything in addition would have to come out, it's going to be general fund financed at least, would have to come out of that growth, that 2% growth that we've assumed in the budget, and would make things even tighter. So there are, to my knowledge, and in our review of the budget, there's no currently planned expenditures for Flint beyond that 2016-2017 slide, and any additional spending would count against that 2% growth that we summarized with at the close of the webinar.
We have another question for Bob. Did the governor propose a contribution to forward fund the state employee retiree health care? So in other words, as we're encouraging local governments to do forward funding, is the governor proposing to do this with state employees?
Yes. So I mean, if I understand the question right, that is the states actually several years back has added money to the budget to pre-fund civil service retiree health care. So that is not a feature of this, a specific feature of this budget, although a part of that state compensation costs might be increases related to that. But the state does pre-fund retiree health care now. That's been the case for several fiscal years.
Again, towards the end of the presentation, you had a slide on the road funding, and it makes it look like even though we voted on road funding last year, May of last year, it makes it look like there's not going to be any new spending right away. Will you confirm that we're interpreting that the right way?
I can confirm that. So the new road plan, and I turn back to that slide, the new road funding will be the orange and dark blue segments of this. So we indeed will have new dedicated road funding. But in terms of how does the ability to spend extra money on the roads compare to our current situation, that increase is pretty small, because while we've been waiting for the new road plan, we have set aside some additional general fund resources for the roads. For fiscal year 2016, that was a little below $400 million. Fiscal year 2017, the new road funding is expected to be about $412 million, I believe. So we'll see very slight growth, and then as those road funds phase in over time, both the tax funds and the income tax redirection will end up getting closer to that $1.2 billion target, but it will take several years. So in terms of what's going to be spent on roads in fiscal year 2017 versus what was available to spend in 2016, there'll be some increase. I think there's some, even beyond the road plan, there's some forecasted increase in our current dedicated revenues. So, but it'll be fairly small. There will not be a sizable increase in new revenues for roads from fiscal year 2017 compared to the 16 available revenues.
All right, we had one other question that I've encouraged the questioner to expand on, or I don't know how to pose this question to either you, Bob, or Craig, so I think we'll handle that one offline. And I don't see any other questions, so let us wrap up with that. Thank everyone for attending. As I said, we'll have this presentation online if you want to share with others. The link will be available on our website. If you click on the resources tab, and then there's presentations, and you'll see both the slides for this and when it's prepared, the link to the recorded presentation. Thank you everyone for coming. If the Citizens Research Council can do anything to help you understand issues or to dig into a topic that's warrants a deeper look, please let us know. Enjoy your weekend and enjoy the rest of today.